How's it going, NBA 621? This is Stephen Tony here, and I'm doing my leader presentation on Phil Knight, the co-founder of Nike. To give you some background on Phil Knight, he was a Division I athlete at the University of Oregon at the time when Oregon was dominating the track and field world. This was right before the running boom in the 1970s. Phil had a vision that there was going to be a potential market for running. So in his MBA program, he wrote a paper that became the basis for his company. He argued that importing Japanese running shoes would be more cost-effective and more profitable than importing German-made shoes, which is what was happening with the company Adidas. After finishing his MBA, Phil Knight went to Japan, convinced Onitsuka to allow him to distribute their running shoes in the United States. How did Phil Knight succeed? I'm going to give a few different reasons why. One was the gifted people he surrounded himself with. Phil Knight recruited his old coach to be a promoter of the brand and also to help design the shoes. He recruited an amazing salesman named Jeff Johnson who helped promote the brand and give awareness. In addition to that, Phil Knight was willing to take risks. He would take out the biggest loan he possibly could from a bank so that he could get the largest shipment possible to the US. He could sell them, get as much money reinvested in the business, and then take out an even larger loan so he could bring in even more shoes. So he was very aggressive in building the business and willing to take those risks. Another thing that Phil did is he was very good at getting professional athlete endorsements. He started with professional tennis players. He transitioned to track and field with Steve Prefontaine. He got the University of Oregon football team to wear Nikes, and he continued to expand that from there to Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods today. You might notice from the slide that Nike's original name was actually Blue Ribbon. The company changed to Nike in 1971, so if you see that discrepancy there, if I say Blue Ribbon, Nike, know I'm talking about the same company. As of 2018, the yearly revenue for Nike hit $36 billion. So it's probably safe to say that Phil Knight's bet on importing Japanese running shoes was a good one. As far as Phil Knight's leadership styles, I pulled a few things from the Business Ethic book and the Resident Leadership book. A few qualities that I want to emphasize are the fact that Phil Knight was a risk taker. I shared his strategy of taking on a great deal of debt and leveraging that to bring in large shipments to build a company. Phil would not have a lot of cash or assets on hand. He would invest everything he possibly could back into the business, even if it meant a pay cut for himself or for his employees. Phil Knight was also competitive. There were times where Onitsuka would recruit other distributors in the US, and Phil Knight would aggressively put them out of business to remain the sole distributor. Phil Knight also had an independent streak. As he was building the company Nike, he also worked as a teacher at a university and also as an accountant. And in both positions, he never felt satisfied because he was working for somebody else instead of living out his own dream. And I find these qualities interesting because Phil Knight shares in the book he was a very timid and shy person. And yet when it came to launching his dream, he was very aggressive and driven. From reading Shoe Dog, I could tell that Phil Knight was more of a pragmatic operator when it came to his philosophy. He was very focused on the numbers. How much did they sell? How much debt could they get? How many shoes could they bring in? What would be the market opportunity of opening up a new office? So it was clear that the practicals, the bottom line is what was driving him and what allowed him to succeed as a leader. As far as the ethical dilemma that Phil Knight faced, it came with the shoe provider Onitsuka in Japan. Both sides, this was a bit of a rocky relationship. In Phil Knight's first meeting when he was convincing them to let him be a distributor, Phil Knight lied and said that he had a shoe company in the United States when he actually had nothing. He convinced them to work with him, and then he ran back and scrambled to get things into place. He repeated this again when Onitsuka was looking at a distributor on the East Coast. Phil Knight said, "We could be a distributor for the entire United States." Onitsuka asked, "Do you have an office on the East Coast?" Phil Knight said yes. They didn't. And Phil Knight immediately called Jeff Johnson and told him, "Hey, could you move your family from California to the East Coast to open up an office? Because they're shipping 5,000 shoes there." So again, he fudged the truth to get things going. Now, on the other hand, Onitsuka was also not a very honest and good partner to work with. There were several occasions where Onitsuka recruited distributors without Phil Knight knowing. Onitsuka was also unreliable in getting inventory and shipments in on time. Onitsuka would then complain why they didn't reach their sale goals, even though they were the ones who had held back on getting the shipments to them. This ultimately escalated. In 1970, Phil confiscated some files from Onitsuka, and he learned from these files that they were planning on cutting ties with Nike and were going to transition to working with other distributors. But it was clear they weren't going to tell them. So Phil Knight began building other relationships with people who could produce shoes for them, and he cut ties first. This led to a lawsuit where Onitsuka was claiming that Phil Knight had breached his contract. Now, Phil Knight ultimately won the trial. And you might be wondering, well, how was he able to when he confiscated files, when he lied about the business being bigger than it actually was on multiple occasions? And the reason why, according to the judge, is Phil and the rest of his staff told the truth. Whereas Onitsuka and their team continued to lie and were not honest about the mistakes that they had made on their side of the bargain and how they had breached a contract. I would say that this falls under the situational leadership theory because with that type of leader, you have to adjust to whoever you're working with. In some cases, you're directive. In some cases, you're more supportive. In his relationship with Onitsuka, and a lot of times he was very deferential to the Japanese because he needed them to provide shoes. Now, when it came to his employees, for instance, Jeff Johnson, the salesman, he was very directed because he needed Jeff to be on board and do what he needed to do in order to get the brand out there. He had a number of different types of people to work with, and he adjusted his style to best meet them so he could close deals and allow his company to succeed. As far as conclusions go, there's two things we can take away. The first is business decisions are not always black and white. Sometimes there's a lot of gray, and in those situations, we have to make the best decision we think is morally right. And if they aren't in retrospect, as in some of Phil Knight's decisions, then we do our best to correct them, just as he did in telling the truth at the trial. The second thing we can take away is that the business world is going to constantly change, and we have to be willing to pivot and adapt and work with it if we are going to succeed. That's what allowed Phil Knight to succeed, is being a situational leader. And for us, that's going to be a good skill to learn as industry changes and learning for ourselves how do we need to change in order to be a successful leader. So hopefully you took some things away from this reflection on Phil Knight and Nike, and hopefully it's an inspiration for you guys to adapt some things in your leadership style.